want to. I want to be someone else, so I'll explode.
Hi, my name is Ian Olander, and this is my channel, Free to Question. I appreciate you showing up. This is my first video, so I apologize in advance for any mistakes in editing or anything that I do. This is my first one. I also would like to make clear that I am not one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses for 40 years, baptized for 30 years. But while I was a witness, I had a lot of questions. And if any of you knew me back when I was a witness, I was very studious. I still am, of course, but at the time I was very, very studious because I just had so many questions, and I tried to find answers to those questions, and I just scoured the publications, everything that I could find, and almost invariably for most of my questions I came up to a wall, came to a point where I just couldn't get the answers that made sense. And I also knew that to push further, to ask any more questions would actually make me be viewed in a negative light. You can only ask so many questions before you're told to just be quiet and just accept it. I had one brother once tell me, Ian, an elder has told you the answer, and that's it. So anyway, so that's why my channel is called Free to Question. Another time I will tell my life story, but today let's just talk about something that's interesting. Specifically, the question, did Jehovah's Witnesses, did the Watchtower organization predict 3 years before it came into existence, did it predict that the United Nations organization would form? And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, all you need to do is go to the Watchtower online library, and then if you go to publications, and there, publications, you go to the index, Watchtower Publications Index, the 186 through 22 subject index, and then if you were to scroll down to P and then scroll down to predictions, then you will see there at the bottom, you will see listed Jehovah's Witnesses, UN to arise 1942. Now you might be wondering, well, what is that? What is this exactly? So to get an answer, let's actually let the organization explain. The video Jehovah's Witnesses, Faith in Action, Part 2 answers that question, gives us the context. So let's go ahead and watch that.
The Second World War was raging. Some felt that these events could lead directly into Armageddon. In spite of this, in 1942, Nathan H. Knorr, the one next appointed to take the lead among Jehovah's Witnesses, spoke at a convention about a Bible prophecy that indicated that significant events had to occur first.
This international war is not the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Before Armageddon comes, the scriptures show a peace must come.
There was no peace on the horizon, and yet we said, peace can it last?
Knorr centered attention on Revelation 17:8, which indicates that a figurative wild beast would come into existence would cease to exist, but then would come back to life. Knorr then drew his listeners' attention to the defunct League of Nations.
The League is in effect in a state of suspended animation and needs to be revived if it is ever to live again. It has gone into the abyss of inaction and ineffectiveness. It is not. Will the League remain in the pit? Again, the Word of God gives answer. The association of worldly nations will rise again.
That association did rise again 3 years later as the United Nations.
They didn't know it was going to be called the United Nations, and we don't make that claim, but they knew it was coming out.
So that would indicate that there would be a time of peace after World War II.
So it was their understanding of Revelation chapter 17 and verse 8. Revelation 17:8 tells of a scarlet-colored wild beast that is being ridden by a woman, Babylon the Great. And it says that the beast was, past tense, but is not, which means that it was in the abyss of inactivity, the way they interpreted it. The League of Nations, which was that beast, was in the abyss of inactivity. And then Nathan Knorr, then president of the Watchtower Society, said that association of worldly nations will rise again. There would be a peace period. And based on that peace period is why in 1943 the Missionary School of Gilead was set up, because it was going to take advantage of that coming peace period. And then also in 1943 the Theocratic Ministries School was rolled out to all congregations. At that time only brothers could be in it, but then in 1958 they came up with a way that sisters could also participate. So it seems like a fairly successful prediction. September 1942, and then the UN, and it's in the midst of war, and most witnesses thought that the war was going to lead up to Armageddon, but in the midst of the war, Nathan Knorr predicted that the UN would come out, or an organization like the UN, a successor to the League of Nations, and that there would be a period of peace. Now, you may wonder, well, why does this matter? I mean, to an extent, it's ancient history. Not ancient and really, but it's a long time ago. The reason it matters, especially to me, was because when I was 14, I attended the Divine Justice International Convention. It's not international. The Divine Justice Convention in Los Angeles in 1988. And I was like a normal teenager, you know. I was certainly not paying attention during every part, even though I did take notes. I was distracted by some of the cute sisters that I noticed at that convention. But at the same time, I was also really starting to concentrate on spiritual things, on the more important things. And so on Saturday afternoon, there was a talk, a symposium of talks given. And these talks were actually given by governing body members. It wasn't broadcast using video technology, but teleconferencing, basically through the tie lines. And so we had Brother Barr and Brother Schroeder, I recall. And so we received this book, Revelation, its grand climax at hand. And I remember how excited I was to get this book, and the energy and feeling that we had from this convention. That following year, the parts on the convention were actually reproduced in these special edition Watchtowers from April and May of 1989, and we placed these in a massive campaign to let people know about the mystery of Babylon the Great. And in particular, we really wanted to highlight Babylon's fornication or spiritual adultery with the kings of the earth. And one of the things we've done at the convention and was broadcast was a resolution. Was broadcast was published and put out against the world empire of false religion. So we placed these magazines. I placed these. I put them on my desk at school. I'm sure I was really popular for doing that kind of thing. But I was excited. And there was a reason I was excited. The reason why I was excited was because I was really seeing, it really felt like Jehovah's hand was on the organization, and I was seeing firsthand proof of that. And one of the things that really was evidence that Jehovah was with us was something mentioned in one of these talks, and it was in those Watchtowers and in the Revelation book, and it had to do with that beast. So at the time, I was starting to make the truth my own. I was starting to really look and try to make sure that this was the truth, and this was one of those things. So the talk was the infamous harlot, her fall and destruction. Albert Schroeder, who was the first registrar of the School of Gilead, he gave that talk, and it was later reprinted in this Watchtower. So let's hear specifically what he had to say, or what the talk had to say, and why this was so exciting.
By divine providence, Jehovah's Witnesses received enlightenment on that mystery in 1942. World War II was then raging at its height, and many thought it would escalate into Armageddon. But Jehovah had a different thought. There was still much work for his witnesses to do. At their New World Theocratic Assembly of September 18 to 20, 1942, with the key city at Cleveland, Ohio, USA, Watchtower Society President Nathan H. Knorr gave a public talk on peace. And at last, therein he reviewed Revelation 17:8, which says of the scarlet-colored wild beast that it was, but is not, and yet is about to ascend out of the abyss, as is to go off into destruction. Nor showed how the League of Nations was from 1920 to 1939. Now, the is not stage has been reached because of the League's demise. But after the war, this combine of nations would ascend out of the abyss. Was that Bible-based forecast fulfilled? Truly it was. In 1945, the international wild beast emerged from its abyss of inactivity as the United Nations.
Now, this wasn't the first time that this prediction was publicized. It was the first time I'd heard of it, of course. But actually, going back even to 1960, the 1960 Watchtower actually contained two articles on the faithful and discreet slave and how the faithful slave has kept awake. And it was a retelling of the modern history of Jehovah's organization and how they had kept awake and the signs of Jehovah had been directing them. And there in that Watchtower article, right here, and I'll go ahead and put that on the screen, it said, yes, the faithful and discreet slave was awake to the coming of 1914. In 1942, the faithful and discreet slave, guided by Jehovah's unerring spirit, made known that the democracies would win World War II and that there would be a United Nations organization set up. You might notice it's a little different than what Brother Morris said. He says, here the article says, they said the democracies would win World War II and there would be a United Nations organization set up. And there's a footnote to the booklet, Peace Can At Last. I was excited. This was exciting to me to see this. This was proof. This was prophecy, basically. I mean, you can call it prediction, but a prediction ahead of time is really prophecy. It's just that the vision didn't necessarily come to the writers, but the understanding did. And so you can imagine how excited I was when a dear older sister in our congregation, she knew I loved the history of our organization, that I was really interested in seeing these kinds of things. Jessie Hull, she gave me this copy of that booklet. It's the one referenced in that 1960s Watchtower. It's the talk that Nathan Knorr gave in 1942. And so I was excited, and you could actually see published 1942. And so how cool it was to see the copyright on that. So I started reading this. I was 17 years old when I got this. I had actually gone to visit my grandparents, who were not witnesses, and I brought a number of older publications that I used to like to read, and this was one of them. So I started reading it, and if you've ever read any publications from the 30s and 40s, then you know that it's not that easy. Sometimes the point is buried amidst a lot of other writing. It sort of meanders from point to point, and it can be a little bit hard to discern the exact point it's trying to make. But I powered through. It was 1991. I was 17 years old. And so as I was reading, I was really looking forward to and getting to the part where it actually foretold the rise of the UN. And so as I was reading, what was interesting was I got to page 11, and it said this. And we're actually going to listen to Brother Knorr talk about this in his talk, because this is the actual recording of that 1942 talk.
Those of a democratic mind hope for a United States of the world, a family of nations, a world association based on the United Nations, including a world legion. Says one spokesman, an international constitutional government will be a post-war necessity. Others argue for a world Bill of Rights. Others say the evidence shows that the hopes of the world are for a League of Nations again. And one college official says that the World Court for International Arbitration must be made the key in a revived league. One of the President's own cabinet members says a world organization with the United Nations as its base will determine the peace, and the post-war world will be policed by the Allied powers.
It said United Nations. And it didn't say United Nations in lowercase, like United Nations, two separate things. No, it was United Nations as if that was a thing. And yet it was published in 1942. Twice in the same paragraph, the booklet and Nathan Knorr mentioned the United Nations. And I remember distinctly being disturbed by that, because it sounded like the United Nations was already a thing. Like the idea of the United Nations was already being floated when Nathan Knorr gave that talk and this booklet was published. It bothered me enough, and it gave me enough misgivings that I just kind of put it down. I think I got called away to go eat dinner or something like that, and it disturbed me enough. I was about to graduate high school the very next year. I'd already made plans to move out to the Navajo reservation to do missionary work, where I stayed for the next 7 years, or need greater work rather. And I had been making the truth my own. I'd been making progress, and I wasn't ready to pick at that thread. And it wasn't something that I consciously felt that I was doing, but that's in hindsight, that's what I was doing. So instead, when I went back to my reading, I read this instead, that the 1958 Convention Report for the Divine Will Assembly. This was much more encouraging to me, because it was actually just about the 1958 International Assembly. 256,000 Jehovah's Witnesses at Yankee Stadium and Polo Grounds, and reading this, the unity, the just how people came from everywhere, and the feat that it was, this was enough to sort of quiet any doubts. And so in the years since then, we'd study the Revelation book at the Congregation Book Study, and I'd study it, but I never really got into that part. I never commented on it, or if I did, I just read what was in the paragraph, and that was it. The question was always there. So now, let's pick at that thread. Let's see, did they predict it? Was the UN already a thing when Nathan Knorr made that comment? Because if it was, that's not really a prophecy, is it? So back then, there was no internet. Today, super easy to look it up. So you just go to go to Google, type in United Nations history, and there it is. History of the United Nations is the first link right there, and then if you click that, you scroll down, you'll see the history of the United Nations. Notice the milestones begin not in 1945 and not in 1944. Obviously, if the UN was started in 1945, it didn't get put together in 1945, but you see it actually goes back to 1941. So what was going on in 1941? It mentions the Atlantic Charter. Actually, it mentions the Declaration of St. James Palace, and then it mentions the Atlantic Charter, which the Atlantic Charter in particular, in its eighth paragraph, discusses post-war preparations or some sort of establishment to set up more organized peace around the earth. This was August of 1941, and that date is important because then in December 1941, Pearl Harbor occurred. The Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor in December 8, 1941, and the U.S. entered into the war. And so then in January of 1942 was the Declaration by United Nations. This was 26 states at war with the Axis powers, listed all of them, all the signatory members. These were the powers that had all decided they were all on the same side. They were allies against Germany, Japan, and Italy. And there was quite a bit of discussion about once the war was over and once the Allies had won. And make no mistake, by the time the U.S. entered into the war was over. I mean, there were a number of years ahead, but Winston Churchill said once the U.S. was in, we knew we had won. I mean, you think about it, the United States had sat out pretty much all of the war with all its resources, all its millions of people just sitting on the bench, fresh and ready. And while Europe, Germany, and the other nations slogged it out between them, and then in 1940, Germany decides to attack the Soviet Union, breaking its pact, and now Germany has war on both sides. And then while Germany is having to deal with all this fighting, here comes the United States, all fresh with renewed energy and with power and with vitality and with youth. It was a foregone conclusion. The U.S. was going to win. The Allies were going to win, rather. Not just the Allies, obviously not just the U.S., but all of the nations working together. So, whatever the case, it's very clear that the Allies, who called themselves the United Nations, were already making plans for a post-war world peace. And they were also making plans for a post-war peace organization. So, is that really prophecy if A, it's pretty obvious who's going to win, and B, they're making plans for what they're going to do, and they're already talking as the United Nations about setting up some sort of organization, some sort of post-World War peace organization? No. But here's something really interesting, because you remember that 1960s Watchtower, what it said was this. In 1942, the faithful and discreet slave, guided by Jehovah's unerring spirit, made known that the democracies would win World War II, and there would be a United Nations organization set up. The interesting thing is, this book doesn't say the democracies, the Allies, would win World War II. And it does not say that there would be a UN organization set up. What it said, and what we're going to see right now, was something a little bit differently, a little less specific. If we go back to that paragraph that mentions the UN, the United Nations, if we look at the previous paragraph, Knorr talks about the political statesmen of the world are also looking ahead to the peace anxiously. And then he talks about at least three different potential post-war establishments that could mean peace. 1, the Nazi dictator has led his hordes on in world aggression with the promise of, to quote him, a social state which must and shall be a model for perfection in every sphere of life. That's 1. 2, and the Pope has published to the world a 5-point program for world peace. Then he mentions, those of a democratic mind hope for a United States of the world, a family of nations, a world association based on the United Nations, including a world legion. It doesn't say, even at this late date, September of 1942, that the Allies were going to win. It said whatever happens at the end, there is going to be some sort of post-war situation or organization set up. And we actually see this if you go on further back to the paragraph that was actually cited in that video, Jehovah's Witnesses, Faith in Action Part 2, where Nathan Knorr said that the worldly organization will come out, the Association of Worldly Nations will rise again. He says this, but mark this, the prophecy shows that when the beast comes out of the abyss at the end of the total war, it comes out with the woman Babylon on its back. And he goes on to define Babylon is the religious organization with headquarters at Vatican City. That's the Catholic Church. It says it comes out with the woman Babylon on its back or she climbs upon its back as soon as it gets out. And remember, we mentioned those 3 situations post-war peace. To this day, the Vatican has not canceled its concordat with the Nazi and fascist dictators, and this year opened diplomatic relations with the sneak attackers of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese. So the Catholic Church is being involved with the Axis powers, in case they win. 2. The Pope's 5-point program calls for the Vatican's free action without interference as one of the requirements of this new order founded on moral principles. So the Catholic Church being involved in this, the 5-point program, is baked in from the beginning. It's already writing as soon as it comes out of the abyss. Likewise, 3rd one, the United Nations, opposing the totalitarian powers, voiced their pledge of freedom of religion as one of the 4 freedoms to be secured when the peace comes. And then he talks about the personal envoy of the U.S. president being treated with the Catholic or the Vatican, and how already they're paying deference and courtesy to the woman Babylon. So she's already influencing that. So what he actually said was that if this side wins, if the Axis powers win, well, the Vatican will, and then establish whatever they're going to establish. The Vatican is already involved in writing that. If the Pope's plan is adopted by whoever the victors are, well, the Catholics are writing that too. And if the United Nations, if the United Nations succeed in setting up a post-war organization, well, they've already are giving special deference to the Catholic Church, and so it will be writing that as well. Is that prediction? Is it prediction when you bet on all the horses and then one of them wins? Like we know in 2024, there's going to be an election. So if I predict that in 2024, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent are going to run, and whoever wins their administration is going to carry out their goals, guess what? One of those 3 things are going to happen. Very likely it won't be the independent who wins. In fact, almost infinitely no chance that they will win. But the point being is that that's not a prediction. One of those things is going to happen. That's what's in this booklet. And that's what Nathan North said. And of course, all these things are going to be in the references that I'm going to put in the video description for you to check yourself, because it's important that you don't take my word for it, but you actually read these things. And I want to emphasize here, facts matter. The truth, it shouldn't be called the truth. It should be called truth, because if it is true, it's unchanging, and it is true whether we believe it or not. 1 + 1 is always 2. There's no way it's ever not. And anybody who claims that it isn't, I'm not afraid to hear their claims. Truth is not afraid of somebody questioning them. Truth is not afraid of being challenged. These are facts. And you can get emotional about it, like I did, and try to say, well, yeah, but the ramifications of it, just kind of back away from it. But truth is truth, and it stands up to all scrutiny. And so I want to make a promise to you that at all times in any videos that I make, I will attempt to be as honest and as truthful as I possibly can. And I will make mistakes, and I may say something wrong or use the wrong term or, make a mistake. And if I do, I will publicly admit that in a video. I will not put it in an asterisk or quietly mention it in a comment, but I'll make the video saying, no, I was wrong on this. But we're just talking facts here, binary facts. This is what the 1960 Watchtower says. In 1942, the faithful and discreet slave, guided by Jehovah's unerring spirit, made known that the democracies would win World War II and that there would be a United Nations organization set up. Is that true? Did the faithful slave, did Nathan Knorr and those others who were taking the lead among Jehovah's Witnesses at that time, in fact, do this? Did they predict the democracies would win World War II? No. Did they predict there would be a United Nations organization set up? No. It's not a prediction if people are already talking about setting up a United Nations like organization, and if your prediction is even more vague than that, where it's just, well, something's going to be set up. That's not a prediction. That's betting on all the horses. So anyway, appreciate your time. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section of the video. Please keep it civil. So I appreciate your time and hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you for tuning in.